Hi, I'm Nick Palmisano, and this is the Bad News Network. President Trump kicked off the week by insulting former Vice President Joe Biden by calling him a low IQ individual. And then he capped off the week by insulting former Senator John McCain, who is deceased, because that's what presidents do in 2019. His beef with Biden is that Biden is now running for president and, according to the polls, has the best chance of beating the president. His beef with McCain is that McCain is the one that handed the FBI the whole Steele dossier, which is the beginning of this whole collusion investigation. The president got so heated about McCain that he even referenced the fact that he gave him the funeral that he wanted and wasn't even thanked for it. Well, he's dead, sir. But none of this Trumpness surprises me. As always, Trump gonna Trump. What is mildly less surprising, but definitely more disappointing, is how few members of the GOP that used to run with Senator McCain are now standing up for him against the president. It's almost like politicians only care about what's politically expedient and can help them in the near future, and really have no morals or belief system other than staying in power. Across the pond, a Muslim gunman from Turkey opened fire in a tram in the Dutch city of Utrecht. Law enforcement officials tracked down the man responsible for the attack and apprehended him earlier this week. According to Utrecht Mayor Jan van Zanen, 3 people have died and at least 9 were wounded. He added that 3 of those were in serious condition. Police say 37-year-old Gokman Tanis is facing multiple manslaughter or murder charges with terrorist intent. The police chief stated that the shooter's motives are yet unclear, but then whispered under his breath, "It's radical Islam." In some of the more wholesome news of the week, a bakery in Tennessee has gone viral after baking a cake for a man's vasectomy. On top of the cake was written, 100% juice, no seeds. Happy vasectomy. Even though the cake was delicious, afterwards the man was upset and confused, stating, "I got a vasectomy so I wouldn't have kids, but when I got home, those brats were still there." This season of The Real World is off the chain. The internet is abuzz about MTV's flagship property after Don and George, who you might remember is married to Kellyanne, had a brutal emotional exchange. George said, "Congratulations, you just guaranteed that millions of more people are going to learn about narcissistic personality disorder and malignant narcissism. Good job." To which Don replied, George, often referred to as Mr. Kellyanne by those who know him, is very jealous of his wife's success and angry that I, with her help, didn't give him the job he so desperately wanted. I barely know him, but just take a look. A stone-cold loser and a husband from hell. If you're thinking that's mean even by MTV standards, don't worry, it actually isn't. That was President Trump and George Conway, Kellyanne Conway, who's the counselor of the president, arguing on Twitter. The state of Missouri is expected to pass a ban on all federal gun laws and even make it a crime to try to enforce them. The bill would essentially nullify any law that infringes on the Second Amendment in any way. State agencies would therefore not be able to enforce any laws that involve gun registration, fees, licenses, or fines of any kind. It'll be interesting to see how this example of federalism plays out. Will Missouri stand alone, or will they be joined by other similarly thinking states, as has happened with cannabis? We're thinking the latter, as Missouri loves company. The aftermath of the terrorist attack in New Zealand has been rife with controversy. Just days after the attack, the New Zealand Prime Minister has announced that she will ban all semi-automatic military-style weapons. This move has turned fevered attention back to the United States and its prolonged tug-of-war regarding the Second Amendment. As I always try to do, I try to let you know my bias before starting any argument. I'm a staunch believer in the Second Amendment, and I absolutely believe that the right to self-defense is an inalienable natural right. I also recognize that we have a unique problem with gun violence, and frankly all violence in this country, and it doesn't offend me when people propose solutions, even if they're solutions that I don't particularly like. With that said, I find the New Zealand decision troubling. Not because they banned semi-automatic weapons. It's their country, they have a different value set than we do, and they can and should vote for whatever they want to vote for. If they want to exchange a component of their freedom for an attempt at increased safety, that is absolutely their right. But emotion is not logic, and leaders absolutely should not be making emotional decisions. This swift emotional action is possible in New Zealand where it isn't in the United States, because they have no right to bear arms. It is considered a privilege in New Zealand, and hence can be taken away by the government at any time for any reason. The The sentiment among Americans that don't believe in gun rights is that, hey, in New Zealand, it only took one mass shooting and semi-automatic weapons are going away. But in America, we've had this occur multiple times and there's still no movement on the removal of semi-automatic weapons. My reaction is exactly the opposite. As an American, I can't fathom having a government that has that kind of power. A situation where they are reacting emotionally to something and removing a right for all time. I'll be the first to tell you that our nation's response to mass shootings has been underwhelming at best. I still remain shocked that the FBI and the police force in Parkland in particular haven't received greater scrutiny by everyone for their colossal failures. There are so many things that we can and should study and try that will simultaneously protect our right to self-defense against both others and the government while simultaneously working to stave off gun crime. One of the quickest arguments that we always hear as soon as the Second Amendment is brought up is that our founding fathers couldn't possibly conceive of these kinds of weapons. Of course they could have. They had cannons that were personally owned at the time. There were automatic weapons that fired using a crank. You've seen them in movies. This technology existed perhaps in a different way, but they certainly knew that this was coming. Others contend that the government is so powerful with close air support and bombs and drones and special operations that the idea that a man with a rifle could stand up against any of that is so old-fashioned that there's really no reason to even pretend the Second Amendment has any value anymore. I'll spare you the jokes about Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, where men with rifles pretty much showed that they could in fact stand up against the United States military. But let me just throw out two other thoughts for you. I have a hard time believing that you would be able to mobilize the lion's share of the United States military against its own citizenry, especially on this particular issue, where so many service members feel strongly in favor of the Second Amendment. I also doubt that the United States government, even a corrupt United States government, would be extremely excited about waging total war against its own citizenry, given that we haven't even done so in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Vietnam. But even if that wasn't the case, the Second Amendment is the amendment that lets you decide. Are you going to just go along with something detestable that the government does? For example, the way the Germans slaughtered Jews in World War II, or the way that Serbs slaughtered Muslims during the 90s in Bosnia and Kosovo and Macedonia? Or are you going to fight with everything that you have against that oppressive, tyrannical government? I appreciate that many of you don't agree with me. And you know what? There's an amendment process to the Constitution for those of you that don't. But admittedly, the part here that leaves me a little flummoxed is that for the most part, those of you that don't agree with me also tend to look at President Trump as a fairly tyrannical man that is skirting the line of fascism. Doesn't that make you consider the real value of an armed citizenry? If this president really were a fascist, and to be clear, there's no part of me that thinks that's the case, even though he has done many things that I find personally detestable, wouldn't you want the ability to fight against that? What if the president tomorrow decided to disband Congress and somehow convince the United States military to go along with that? What would you do if you were unarmed? Anyway, that's just food for thought. In church news, defrocked priest and child molester Hadmels de Frias is teaching English to kids in the Dominican Republic. An NBC News correspondent found de Frias working out of a school in Punta Cana, where he has also become a bishop at the Progressive Celtic Church. What could possibly go wrong? As special counsel Robert Mueller's report comes close to its big reveal, President Trump is left unimpressed. The president stated he was as in the dark as the public about what might be in the report. He stated that there was no collusion, no obstruction, and that everybody knows this. It's all a big hoax. If true, we can only hope that this whole thing ends with Ashton Kutcher walking into the Oval Office with a big eating grin on his face saying, "You're punked! Welcome to the new season!" For the next report, I'm tagging in resident South Boston news correspondent, Matthew Finney.
In stupid news, a World War II memorial in South Boston was found vandalized. The memorial was found by local residents with an oil-like substance splashed all over the names of World War II soldiers from Southie and Dorchester. As expected, there was no shortage of people asking the perpetrators to come forward so they could get their faces rearranged. $100 says it wasn't even a local who did this. It was some college kid that was coming out of Connecticut that just wanted to fight the war machine or something stupid like that. And for that kid, I got a message for you. 1, don't do that. And 2, You dropped 150 grand on an education you could have got for $1.50 in late charges at the public library. How do you like them apples?
A federal court ruling on Thursday protected the First Amendment by allowing PACs that actually have no affiliation with a candidate to still use that candidate's name. FEC Chair Ellen Weintraub was pissed, stating this might open up the floodgates for a lot of scam PACs. She then flipped her desk and gave the court the double bird while walking out. Moments later, she announced her new PAC, Federal Judges or Pederasts. And finally, this week we're bypassing Florida Man News for a special report we like to call Texas Man News. A career criminal attempted to break into my friend and longtime business partner, Tim Kennedy's home this week. For those of you that don't know anything about Tim, Tim was a top 10 UFC fighter for years, was a member of 7th Special Forces Group and then 19th Special Forces Group, and teaches a course called Sheepdog Response that basically teaches people how to hurt people that want to hurt you. For as long as I've known him, he's basically only enjoyed 3 things: shooting things, beating people up, and food. Breaking into his house has got to be the dumbest thing in the world. I can't get into the details of the attack for legal reasons, but this is right up there with trying to get a selfie with a jaguar. This is right up there with trying to have sex with an alligator, trying to get into a bar fight with Mike Tyson, having a nice meal with Hannibal Lecter, trying heroin just to see what it's like, being a socialist, or blowing a 28-3 lead in the Super Bowl against the New England Patriots. The level of stupidity here is just so profound that it hurts. It's basically like a birthday gift for Tim. This is like his greatest moment. Try to break into my house. I've been waiting my whole life for this. And for those of you wondering, Tim Kennedy is A-OK. And with that, I'm Nick Palmisano, and this is the Bad News Network. Our news is at least as bad as the news you're getting already, and if you've got a great idea and that idea is to break into Tim Kennedy's house, I highly recommend you go into a tiger cage instead.